This is a message for risk management professionals, those who work with processes and controls, and who are interested in reducing the risk in their complex processes and systems. Hi, I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. Here's the premise of my talk today. I'm going to keep it real short and sweet. Anything other than an effective control is an issue factory. So what's a control? A control is a point in time where you're validating work or checking work in order to prevent or detect some kind of risk. So if you're in the security business and you have a gate, you might check that that gate is locked at the end of the day. And the risk is if the gate is unlocked, that people could traverse through the gate and you could have property loss. Now, folks, I know I'm oversimplifying it. The issue itself is when someone discovers that a risk exists and is not being mitigated, or there has been a failure to mitigate a risk, such as the gate is unlocked and open and someone has moved through the gate, or the gate was found to be unlocked and open when it should have been closed. So an issue is a corrective action or remediation of a failure in control. Now, you can get an issue when you don't have a control in place at all, or you can get an issue when you have an ineffective control. So the premise of what I'm sharing here right now is that anything other than an effective control is an issue factory. I mean, you're creating the issues. So it's kicking the problem down the line. Now, what are some of the mistakes that people make that causes controls not to be properly documented, not to be properly created? Well, the first one is not understanding what is a control. Now, when you understand what the risks are, controls actually come pretty natural. So if the risk is you have a warehouse, you have a gate that's locked, the risk is that someone would come to the warehouse and remove items out of the warehouse. That's one of the risks. But you might also have a risk that the gate is there in order to prevent people from trespassing on the property, where there could be a potential security or a potential safety hazard. See, the gate itself is not the control. That's kind of what you're doing to create the control. The gate being closed at the appropriate time, monitored by the appropriate people, that's the control itself. If you understand the underlying risks, it makes it easier to understand why the control exists. Because there might be some people who come in the morning and they don't like the gate to be closed. I worked on a military base and every vehicle had to stop, show an ID before they can go onto the base. So the gate was essentially closed all the time. And the only way the gate could be opened is if the control activity showing the pass, being validated, was there in order to open the gate. There might be people who don't want the gates. It seems like a waste to have to go to the visitor center and get your badge and then go to the front gate and show your badge. And think, why couldn't I just go in? So you're constantly fighting the real risks that exist, and your assessment of those risks, your rationale of those risks, and where those risks sit in your organization, because some risks have requirements. If you have a risk about releasing liquids from a manufacturing process, perhaps the liquids need to be tested before they're released. There might be regulatory reasons why and how that particular control is done. So you have to understand the risks and the relationship of those risks to potential controls or expected controls, then go through the controls to make sure there's a parity, that those two match. But what other mistakes do people make? They might not be using the available taxonomy. So a taxonomy is how the control is written, so you have some standardization. Taxonomies also support how the control might be tested in the future. And so if you write something that is not conforming to that standard language, then somebody testing it is going to fail it automatically. And then, boom, you get an issue. Taxonomy also helps understand the risks, but they can confuse things if those taxonomies are constantly changing. And this leads to people believing that controls are actually standalone when they're not. See, a control is dependent on the risk, but lives inside of a process. And so if the control is not documented properly, or documented properly but not actually representative of the activity, then there's automatically going to be a defect there. A good thing to think about issues is that they're a formal defect. And let's go into another mistake. Another mistake is not allowing enough time to create an effective control. And of course, there's a lot of things that lead to that. There could be changes to the other underlying business while the control is being developed. So maybe the control takes too long to document. The business is executing and maybe figuring out how they want to do a certain amount of work or activity, and that work changes. Control gets written based on their previous understanding of the work and then gets tested against their current functionality of the environment. Now, if you're saying right now that, oh my gosh, Justin, this is extremely complex. Well, it is, because of all the risk factors that are involved in an organization, whether it's COSO, whether it's some kind of regulatory risk, whether it's some kind of reputational risk. All of these risks are changing while you're controlling for them. Now, the good news is there's a solution. The solution is having controls in production that are effective, not just on paper. So it means actually in the work environment, have controls in place, simple controls, the minimal number of controls that are actually being executed against the risks, whether you're preventing them or detecting them. You have a clear connection between the control itself and the risk itself. And then you have some function to periodically review these risks and work on these risks. So when we're in a complex working environment, we often look at our controls very abstract. So, for example, the people writing down the control for compliance may not be the people who actually execute the control for the customer. And so there can be differences between the language, between the approach, between what we believe should be done or shouldn't be done. There might be shortcuts that individual contributors make that makes the process run smoother, but overall might bypass some of the controls that are necessary to make the process compliant. So just because the work gets done smoothly doesn't mean the work gets done according to laws, rules, and regulations. So you have some kind of periodic review. What are we looking at in that periodic review? Well, we're looking at, can we evidence our effort to reduce risks or to identify those risks? Now, here's the challenge. We're in a legalistic environment. We need evidence that's not just showing you did the work. We need evidence that satisfies government regulators, satisfies internal auditors, satisfies individuals who may come and look at this process. So one of the best tips is to make sure your controls are easy to understand by an uninformed third party. So however the control is written, that taxonomy, however the control is written, an uninformed third party can read that control and understand exactly what is happening there. Now, that could be the 5 whys, it could be some other formula, but it's usually addressing the who does the work, the who, what, when, where, and why. And the why is usually tied to the risk itself, actually calling out that particular risk. There's other factors such as the parity between elements. And I'm saying not parity as in joke, which most controls end up being a joke over time because all these things can change and it moves away from what's actually happening. I mean parity as in they are tied to each other. So if you have a control that addresses 2 or 3 risks, the definition of those risks influences the characteristics of the control. So if the risk is an anti-money laundering risk, so transactions over a certain amount, such and such needs to happen to comply with the regulation. And the risk is that those transactions could be used in some kind of illegal activity, which would look poorly on the bank, but also have administrative costs associated with it. You need to make sure that the control activity satisfies the characteristics of the risk element. Now, it's possible that you may have more than one risk being satisfied by a single control, but you could also have one risk being satisfied by multiple controls. It just depends on how granular the work is. Now again, geez, folks, this seems overly complex. Well, we're mapping human systems into some kind of paperwork, some kind of means of monitoring or checking work. Ultimately, what we're doing is we're documenting the process, the risks and the controls. Then we're applying labor and inputs, and then we're able to observe the activity, the physical activity, over time against the original intended description. So the control as it was written should be implemented physically that way, and then some point in the future we should be able to have evidence that the control continued to be implemented consistently. See, an effective control is a consistent control. Here's a way of looking at this that really helps you understand it. Whether you think about some physical mechanical activity, such as riding a bicycle. You turn the pedals turns a gear, the gear turns a chain, that chain turns the back sprocket, and depending on the amount of friction or the surface of the inflated amount of inflation in the tire, you're going to have some kind of forward movement. If you think about this as a physical activity, you can start seeing how there are interconnected parts, but you can map out these interconnected parts. So for example, if you're looking from a risk perspective, you can ask the question, of these risks, what controls do we use to prevent or detect? So you have a list of risks, and you should be able to provide a list of controls associated with those risks. Now, it's very possible that you're going to have duplication in the second column, which is the list of controls. Now, you can flip that, and you can use controls as the index, but you can't both index on risk and controls. Now, even more important is those controls live inside of a process. Those processes themselves have risks. So you have to reconcile the risks associated with the process and the risks associated with the controls. And so for every risk associated with a process, there ought to be a control to address that risk. And for every risk associated with controls, there should be an up-to-date control with evidence that addresses that risk. And you can also flip that around. For every control we have, is it addressing a risk? Because you do, over time, want to reduce the number of controls. And I understand, I acknowledge this is a complex activity. And so the approach really must be an interrogation of those people who are using those controls that evidences the activity with artifacts. Now, the best way of doing this is to make sure that your process evidence that you're compliant with the risk, that your control activities create artifacts that evidence that you're using the controls, which then are tied to those risks. You end up with a matrix that includes your process, your risks, and your controls. And there's checks and balances between pairs of activity, not across the board, but pairs of activity under kind of the A equals B equals C. So if processes and risks are properly mapped, then you should be able to develop a set of controls within that process, which you can then validate by looking at your controls addressing the original risks. See those pairs? And it goes in a loop, because you start with the risk. What are the risks that we're trying to detect or prevent? Well, what processes do we need to create the deliverables? Okay. Well, what processes do we need to cover the risks? Merge those two. Within those processes, where are we addressing the risks? That's the control. Now that we have the control, we can then ask the question, have we addressed all the risks in this process? Does this make sense? Now, we have to understand that those risks can change on the timeline between the original control development and the final control development. So we want to add some kind of self-assurance activity, which would be periodic validation of the entire cycle. Not just the controls, but the entire cycle. Are these risks still relevant? Are these processes both appropriate to the deliverables and to the risks in which we have identified? Do these controls address the risk? Then are these controls effectively implemented? Now we're back to the beginning, because a control that is not effectively being implemented is a defect. And not addressing risks could in some cases be a violation of a law, rule, or regulation, which would amplify that overall risk. And therefore, an issue, a formal means of remediation, is put in place. Now, I said interrogate. Interrogate. Well, that's what it feels like sometimes when you're being audited. But internally, if you're able to look at the documentation and the actual activity and see that we have integrity between control language. So some companies have what's called a common control library. So if you have these risks, here's a model of a control that we might use. How close is your actual control to the model? Because again, somebody from the outside is going to come in and look at this, and they're not going to understand that you do things slightly differently so that you can be more efficient, and you're trying out something different over here. All they care is that you identified this risk. You said you'd control for it this way, and you didn't do it. You also want to look at the clarity, not the bulk, not the volume of jargon, not how many pieces of paper, but how clear are your control descriptions? How clear are your procedurals? How clear, these are artifacts. How clear is this to some uninformed third party? Now, the best uninformed third party to test this all on is that new employee. When you onboard a person, do they understand your controls? Do they understand why you're doing these controls? Because if they don't, they're going to bypass them. But ultimately, clarity. And this means you have to allow time to ask hard questions. I've worked with some great people who use an interrogation technique where all they do is ask questions. It seems like they're beating around the bush a little bit, but they're asking questions to get clarity. They're trying to see whether there's consistency in the description of the work, and if they find there's not consistency, then they will they'll know where to look next. So they're diving into the work itself. Now, there's an approach or an action that you can take next, which is essentially understanding that this failure is evidence there's a problem. You're not going to know where the problem is until you do a self-assurance on the controls themselves, but the controls don't live by themselves. So what I've seen happen and works really well is a very consistent, it's called RACI, RCSA, Risk and Control Self-Assessment. If it's one activity that's looking at the process, the control, the risks, doing these parity checks, looking at the consistency of language, interviewing the process owner, the control owner, the subject matter experts, noting any types of inconsistencies, and then identifying defects, this RCSA group can also have a central library of all the processes and procedures. Because, again, the reason we end up with a common control library is because the risks are uniform. We have a risk library, we have control library, certain combinations of risks. We already know how they were addressed by other businesses. How different is this other unit addressing it? Well, where can we meet in the middle? Consistency. There's issues in audit findings just because when the auditors come in, they couldn't understand why would you approach it that way. There wasn't enough evidence, there weren't enough artifacts to justify addressing the control in that manner. Do you know that has nothing to do with how effective the control was, but you still got an issue? See, we can't focus on the issues. We can't focus on the defects. Those are a result of failures in the design of your process. So let's go back to the bicycle example. If you're not able to pedal the bicycle fast enough, so for the amount of effort that you can exert on the pedals, you're not able to reach the speeds that you want. Is that the fault of the bicycle? Well, not necessarily. You could be in the wrong gear. You could be on a slope, so the environment around you could be changed. You could have flat tires on the bicycle. We have to treat these as holistic systems, but we also have to understand how there is interaction between components. And by understanding those interactions between components, any failure in one component may not be the root cause. It may not be the original factor. Individuals on a bicycle, they've got it in the right gear. They're pedaling as hard as they can. The back tire is inflated. The wheels are moving, but they're on a stand. The wheel's not in contact with the ground. Everything about the system is functioning as it should, except there's no wheel-to-ground contact to give you forward acceleration. But you could have the same problem if the bicycle was butted up against the wall. And he's pedaling as hard as he can. He's still not going anywhere. It's because he's up against the wall and there's an outside obstacle. In both situations, the individual's effort and difficulty of that effort is a symptom of a larger problem that could be variable. Again, The RCSA is not a magic fix-all, but you actually have to go through some kind of regular self-assessment that's looking at both risks and controls as the parity, and ultimately correcting issues in the process, reviewing the deliverables, looking for evidence and artifacts that the work is actually being done, even looking for optimization in the process to see where we can do this a little bit better. A bicycle on a level path, a level paved path has better function than a level gravel path. We got to look at the whole environment. We got to understand that things change. Risks change over time. And so rather than those risks triggering a separate activity, it is a flag in a list that is added to the review cycles. Now, again, I agree this is a complex set of work. And if you don't have independent review, if you don't have credible challenges that are in writing and kind of libraried so you can see if the same challenge came up multiple times, if you don't have a proper issue management environment where you're taking your lessons learned and feeding it back into your self-assessments to improve the underlying processes, if you don't have a forecast mechanism like an ARIA, which is a enterprise risk brain cramp. It's basically an assessment. So you're assessing future risks based on these changes and you're feeding that to your RCSA. If you don't acknowledge the complexity, yet focus on key elements and how they connect to each other, you're going to end up putting in a lot of effort and not reduce the risk. There'll be a lot of great looking paperwork, but it doesn't reflect the actual work in the environment. There will be individuals who are working really hard, but they can't explain the basics about the process they use every day. You'll be in a situation where new risks will show up and you won't properly map them into an environment. And yes, it is complex. Now, if you pile on arbitrary timelines and you say, oh, well, you've got 50 controls, it'll take you 2 or 3 minutes to rewrite each one, and because you're looking at the individual task rather than where that task lives in a larger ecosystem, then yes, you're going to produce poor quality controls that are then going to create risk in the environment and ultimately be addressed with some kind of activity or remediation. Now, again, the worst thing that can happen, and I haven't touched on it here and I won't go into it a lot, but the worst thing can happen is you could have a risk that stays in the environment for a long period of time and you don't know it's a risk. And now when a regulator comes along, they see it's a risk and they see it's been going on for a long time and now you get a massive fine. I know that fear is there, but again, it's that foundation. Process, risk, and controls. What's the relationship between those items? Are we actually doing what we said we were doing? Slowing down. Is this process overly complex? Does this risk really exist where it is? Now, there's a lot of ways of addressing this. If you have specific questions, I'd be happy to talk about it in the context of your environment. Some organizations handle this through OSHA guidelines, through bank regulators, through different types of platforms that really do spell out every detail of how they should address a certain risk. It's just a matter of taking that risk, codifying it in a control, and then putting it inside of a process. But for other environments, it's more complex. You might be using artificial intelligence or machine learning, and you're impacted by model risk, which is a little bit harder to explain because explaining the model might reveal confidential information. Or maybe the model is difficult to explain because it's machine learning and the machine is making adaptations that the humans around don't really understand, but they're feeding it. So maybe you have to look at the inputs more than the outputs. But ultimately, again, if you have questions about this or anything else I cover, my name is Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. And what I've tried to share with you today is a concept and control evaluation that implemented in control development side really reduces your risk. It helps you create more effective controls. I covered a little bit about what are controls and what are issues. If that's new to you and you're interested and you have more information, we'd love to have more people in the risk management world. And I acknowledge it is super, super complex. And if there's any ways that I can make this more clear for you, so that you can reduce risk in your environment, increase profitability, reduce downtime, then contact me at www.insidestrategicrelations.com, where we help professionals transform business relationships into profit. We do that through critical thinking, risk management, and program management. Until next time, I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. Thanks for listening.